there are those of us who not only don't believe we're not our brothers and sisters' keeper, we don't believe we're our brothers and sisters' brother and sister. So to me, when we advocate for social justice, much of that is really advocating to belong and to be seen. It's basically saying, recognize my humanity, and I can recognize yours. That's a social justice request. That's also profoundly spiritual. And it's one thing to recognize it in the abstract, but it's another to organize our world, our society, our neighborhoods, our schools, our churches, our synagogue, our mosques that reflects that.
Hello, Masud.
Hey, Nava, what's going on? Looking effervescent and like you're deep in foliage in the jungle somewhere. I don't know where you are, but it looks very exotic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's talk about our guests. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
All right. John Powell, the extraordinary John Powell. He's our guest today. He's a renowned social justice advocate and theorist. Professor John A. Powell has cast the light of his penetrating mind on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice, concentrated poverty, opportunity-based housing, voting rights, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality, social justice, and what democracy should look like. Professor Powell has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. He's not only a civil rights lawyer and policy strategist, he is also a professor of both law and African American studies. Man, this guy's deep. And the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. Last but not least, he's the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Professor John Powell, what an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us here on Undaunted.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
That's great to have you, Professor. You've got some really big ideas. Before we unpack those ideas, I was wondering if you could paint a picture of your life and just sketch out the journey that led to the development of those ideas.
Okay. I'll give it a shot. I grew up in Detroit. I'm 6 of 9 children. My family moved to Detroit in 1943. Sharecroppers coming from the South, where they had economically a pretty rough life, but love just sort of permeated the house. People came to the house just to be in the presence of really my mom and dad. My first falling in love was with my mom. I still think she's like the coolest person that ever walked the face of the earth.
Oh.
Being the youngest of 4 boys, I saw my brothers and sisters really have their lives sort of being limited. And I decided that I would try to change that, not just for them, but for other people as well. And being part of this loving family, I would go to church every Sunday. In fact, we go to church more than Sunday. We go to church 2 or 3 times a week.
Wow. Yeah.
And at the end of each sermon on Sunday, the preacher, whoever was preaching, would ask the question, does anyone have any questions? And I was 11 years old, and it hadn't occurred to me before then, but in the 11 years that I'd been at the church, no one had ever asked a question. But I stood up that day, and there was a audible gasp in the church. And the preacher, Brother Manuel, he said, that's all right. Brother Powell, what is your question? And I asked them, so what's going to happen to the Chinese? And the reason I asked that question is that at the church, they taught that unless you were baptized in that church, you're going to hell. And the minister started going around the Bible to give me an answer, taking me to different passages, and none of them seemed adequate. And I never went back to church after that. Mm-hmm. And my family was so religious, still are, that it created a fracture in my family. It lasted a number of years. Eventually, I think we finally, actually my mom, we finally healed it. But it was hard because I was sort of pushed out of this cocoon. And
Wow.
but one of the things that did was to put me on a path for an alternative journey that might include the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, so what was it about that moment? Was it because you didn't feel it was inclusive of a whole, part of the population, or you just didn't feel like you were getting the answers that you needed?
It was actually quite profound in the sense that I believed. So when I left the church, I thought not only was others Chinese going to hell, apparently, but so was I. But it also seemed to me just fundamentally wrong to condemn. At that time, it was just under 1 billion people in China. I think it's 800 million. And I knew just from my reading that most of them had never heard of Jesus. They didn't have an opportunity to accept and be baptized in the church. And it just seemed to me, how could that be? How could that just seem wrong? And I remember having conversations with God about, I'm not someone free of blemishes. I could be a rascal. I could be naughty. But this right here this just seemed to me to be wrong. And so for the first year or so afterwards, like I said, I thought I was going to hell too, but I couldn't be a part of something that was going to condemn that many people without a chance. And so I started looking for alternative pathways, and I think that had a big impact on my life. I think that at the foundation of my life, you never really know, but I think my family is there. As I got older, I felt like I was becoming more and more like my mom and dad, but through a different lens. I had opportunities that they never had. I got to go places they never went to. In a sense, a deep caring and love of life, I think, started with my family. And a lot of what I've done and try to do is live that and reflect that and create the possibility for our life to really flourish. And I think as I moved around, I found pockets, where somebody was accepting one group but not another group. And then when I was graduating from high school, I'd done well in high school. This is 1964. I got a scholarship to Harvard. And by that time, I'm starting to heal the rift with my parents. But I told them I was not going to go to Harvard, and they asked me why. And they didn't really understand education. They both had dropped out of, I think my mom finished high school. My dad dropped out in the 3rd grade. He had to go to work. But as you know, at that time, Harvard didn't accept women. And I said I would not go to a school that didn't accept women.
Wow.
And, that was before the language of feminism or stuff like that had actually taken hold. So I didn't have a language for it. Again, it just seemed to me wrong. And people said, what does that have to do with you? And I have 5 sisters. It's like, what do you mean what has to have to do with me? So it actually created another rift in my family.
Wow.
I remember my dad saying to me, if you don't accept the scholarship to Harvard, we're not going to help you go to college. But it was an idle threat because my parents still were had very limited economic means. And so but anyway, I ended up going to Stanford instead, coming out to the West Coast. And in many ways, I think those of us who have to leave our home spend a good deal of our time looking for another home. And to me, it's not surprising when I look at our work now in terms of othering and belonging, that has become a theme of my work. And so rather than talking about race or poverty or injustice generally, it's really about looking for a home and belonging, but belonging not just for me or my group, but where everyone, all human beings belong, and even other life expressions themselves.
I studied at the London School of Economics. I did my master's there, and my focus was on comparative politics, but I'm a youth empowerment activist, and my focus was on youth radicalization. At the time, if you remember, ISIS was one of our biggest threats, and people were wondering how on earth so many young people were being recruited into these extremist groups. And of course, at the time, all the texts that I was reading from professors mentioned nothing of belonging, but mentioned things that obviously weren't computing: psychological factors, geographical factors, physical factors. I believed that belonging was behind it. And so when I found out about your work, it just resonated with everything I've ever seen and believed in. Speak to us a little bit about, what does it mean to co-create in a society? What does that look like?
Belonging, it sounds soft. There's nothing wrong with soft, but it sounds soft. It sounds mushy. Mm-hmm. It's not that. Maslow talked about the hierarchy of human needs, and he thought belonging was the third most important need. I think safety and food for Maslow was 1 and 2, and then belonging. His students said, no, it's belonging, because you don't get safety or food unless you belong. And so, to me, in some ways, it's a translation. So when we talk about love, when we talk about respect for life, we're actually talking about belonging. And what occurred to me, and what occurs to me now, is that what's happening is that some groups say, I belong, but you don't. Mm. So they use belonging to actually constitute othering. Mm-hmm. I'm the good person, you're the bad person, the truly deserving person. And like you, as I sort of watch the world, I see that, yes, we push people away, and then we're surprised that when they try to make sense themselves. And belonging, to me, is not the same as inclusion. Inclusion is when you're inviting someone into your thing. I use the example of, if I have a party and all of you are invited, and I hope you'll come, but it's my music, my food, my friends. Hope you like old Motown. That's inclusion. Right. You're included on terms that I set. Mm-hmm. And somehow that doesn't feel right. But co-creation is saying we all participate in creating the larger world that we live in. It's not your world. It's not my world. It's our world. We all participate in it. We don't control it, but we participate in it. And so co-creation then says the thing you're joining or being a part of is you're joining in part because you also are co-creating. You bring something to it. Life is constantly about exchanges between different aspects of life. And to cut that off, come in and shut up, doesn't feel right. And so co-creation is one of the key parts of belonging, as distinguished from inclusion.
I mean, the way I see it in some ways is that you're truly, society is depriving itself of all of its assets and all of its resources when you're not having that co and mutual creation existing. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And in part, we all are situated. We all have histories. We all have our life experiences, and they're different. And our lives reveal something, but they also cover something. We all have blind spots, but we have different blind spots. And so when we come together and take part in each other's lives, we actually cover some of those blind spots. And so, yes, when we talk about diversity, and sometimes people talk about diversity as a threat, diversity is what allows life to actually flourish. And so you're exactly right that, you think of how many, brilliant people who contribute to the cure of cancer or climate change, or wasn't given a chance because of the wrong gender, because of the wrong race, because of the wrong religion. So we keep playing with a smaller and smaller group of people. And as you said, not taking advantage of all the stuff that we have. And the most important thing we have is each other. and not necessarily for producing stuff, because life is not simply about stuff, but it's really about belonging and love. And whatever we exclude, we also feel like we have to control, and we're afraid of them. I give an example that most of us like parks. Go to take our kids to the park, go ice skating or whatever. But we've been taught to be afraid of the forest. And the reason is we don't control the forest. The forest is full of unknowns. Things are growing at their own pace. Things are talking to each other in their own language. And we are not quiet enough oftentimes to listen. If we were quiet enough, we realize they're talking to us as well. But instead, what we do is like, okay, I'm going to put this flower right there, stay there. I'm going to put this tree right here, stay there. I'm going to put a fence around this thing and control. And that's what we do with people that we don't understand. I mean, when 9/11 happened, one of the things they were saying is that there are these people halfway around the world that we know nothing about. So why not? How is that? The world's not that big. Why don't we know something about them? And in many ways, our reaction wasn't to let's actually be curious about them. Let's invite them in. It's like, let's control them.
Yes.
And so the world will always be dangerous if we're excluding people.
It makes me think of so many things. Obviously, the work of bell hooks, James Baldwin. I was thinking about a quote by, I think it's by the English poet John Donne that Dr. King used to reference. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. You know that one. Right. Yeah. I'm thinking about being intentional in terms of building relationships, right? This is something, of course, in the Black community we're accustomed to because this is the way that we've been socialized in the United States. We're accustomed to being in spaces where we're the only one, right? Where there are people from other cultures, generally white people, who are gathered, and then we are kind of in some ways infiltrating that space, particularly if we're not welcomed in that space. And I'm thinking about now the challenge is, in many ways, is to get our white brothers and sisters, right, to open up and to choose to be in spaces where they are the minority. And for us, as in the African-American community and other marginalized populations, to also recognize a sincere effort and to welcome them in to that space. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that intentionality, and I think courage is somewhere in there as well. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that perhaps.
Well, that's a beautiful question. And like Nava's question, it's also complicated, which is hard to do with justice in a short period of time. But I'll try to give you some highlights. So yes, I think part of the thing, so it's not just numbers. Yes, the numbers are shifting, and based on current categories, whites will not stay the majority for much longer. Now, those categories could shift. And if they shift in a certain way, whites could stay the majority for a much longer time. What am I talking about? So, for example, what if, like the Irish, we decide that Latinos are actually white? Then the category of white will remain a numerical majority, certainly for the rest of the century. But that may or may not happen. That's contingent. But also, being a majority is not just numbers, it's also power. So everywhere around the world, the majority are women. But there are very few places in the world where women are represented, even consistent with their numbers. And certainly, they're less likely to, but certainly women don't usually dominate. Someone said, if you look around the world and look at world leaders, less likely to be warmongers if they're women. It may or may not be true, but it's at least worth investigating. So it's not necessarily the case that, you only have to look at South Africa, where whites only represented 11% of the population. But for many years, they totally dominated the population, both economically, militarily, culturally. And so part of it is giving up the need to dominate. And giving up that need is not just something that we should actually suggest and even demand of whites. We should demand it of all of us, that dominating is the opposite of coming together and loving. And because in our society, whites have dominated. Some people are explicit about that. They think the appropriateness for whites to dominate. It's hard for them to imagine a world where they don't dominate. I've spent time in China, complicated country, it has to be with over 1 billion people. But it's also part of our rub with China. And there was the headlines about 8 years ago saying, we're moving to a place where the first time in human history in the last 300 years, the world may be dominated by a country that's not Christian or white. Just read the paper when you read about conflict between the United States and China. It's almost always spoke of in terms of domination. Who will dominate, this country or this land or that? It's like, why is there a need to dominate? And I posit that what whiteness represents in the West is domination.
Yeah.
I'm not saying white people, I'm saying the concept of whiteness. So you're running upon colonialism, you run upon indigenous people, literally the language, reading some of those early discussions of why take the land from Native Americans? Because they're not using it productively. They're not using it to build stuff. And so, or the white man's burden, or anyway, whatever. So the point is that, yes, you're right. I think we have to be generous and invite people in. But if you go back to the title of my book, which I'm actually updating now, it's actually calling for new self. It's calling for a new way of being in the world, being in the right relationships. And we don't actually know what that looks like. We don't have much practice in that. And that's what King and others tried to call us to. And there was some experimentation in the 60s and 70s, but we've gotten away from that. So in that experimentation, learning to be in relationship, learning to love, learning not to dominate, I think whites have a particularly maybe difficult time with that. But all of us do, because oftentimes we talk about the number switching, we talk about we will now dominate. And that's not what we're going for. We're not going for, we're going to switch the person who's dominating the group that's dominating. It's like nobody dominates.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because when you look at just the root, the idea of dominating, this idea of control comes from the place of the ego. It's such a primal, outdated method of intending to survive. But right now, when we've come so far as a civilization, that is following that ego-driven desire to control and to dominate is what will lead to our demise.
That's exactly right.
And then it makes me think about this idea and concept of spirituality, because the idea of spirituality is this idea. Masud and I are both Baha'is. And so what is behind the faith, the Baha'i faith, is this idea of oneness. Could you speak to us a little bit about the relationship between spirituality from your perspective and social justice? How one, you have explained, should be underpinning the other, or that they should be mutually supporting each other and that they need to go hand in hand. Speak to us a little bit about this.
Well, you're sharing that you're both Baha'i. That explains a lot. So
I hope that's a good thing.
It's a very good thing. It's a great thing.
Oh, thank you, brother. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Nava, you're exactly right. I mean, I oftentimes say, people talk about us being developing interrelationship with each other, acknowledging that we are connected. And I sort of step back a little further and say, that's reality for me. We are connected. We are humans. Human means of the earth. We've forgotten that. Human, literally coming from the earth. Yeah. We are born physically connected to another being. And also spiritually and psychologically connected. Yeah. And so when we engaged in a practice of denying that some people are connected to us, I just spoke to some Black ministers down in Los Angeles, and I said, there are those of us who not only don't believe we're not our brothers and sisters' keeper, we don't believe we're our brothers and sisters' brother and sister. We don't want to, think about it, at the end of the 19th century, Darwin was controversial. because he said there was only one species of humans. So no, that can't be right. Then why do some people look this way and that way? There's all these species. And so Darwin, without trying to become controversial, became controversial. He said there's one race, it's human. And everything else that we have is explained in terms of people adapting to their environment. So to me, when we advocate for social justice, much of that is really advocating to belong and to be seen. It's basically saying, recognize my humanity, and I can recognize yours. That's a social justice request. That's also profoundly spiritual. It's one thing to recognize it in the abstract, but it's another to organize our world, our society, our neighborhoods, our schools, our churches, our synagogue, our mosque that reflects that. What would our relationship be to each other and the earth? I mean, it's not surprising that Native Americans refer to the earth as mother. We refer to it as something to be exploited, extracted. The earth is keeping us from our precious minerals and our oil. And literally, this is the same relationship in terms of dominance that we have over the earth, we have toward each other.
Yeah.
And then we wonder, it's like, okay, so now there are fires and hurricanes and floods, and maybe we've done too much. And so you're right. If we don't fix this, it's not the earth that needs fixing, it's us that need fixing. We need to sort of practice in such a way that we recognize interconnectedness with each other and with the earth itself. And that practice will have to be both the spiritual and a social justice practice. So some people who embrace spirituality think of it as just something that happens inside of us. And some people who embrace social justice think it's something that just happens outside of us. And it's clear, to me at least, that it goes both directions. And there's a phrase by Don Cherry, jazz cornetist, who said, the inside is not, the outside is too. And I know that's kind of a mind tease, but it's beautiful. Basically, the schism between the inside and outside is in many ways a false construct. So I think that to live a life in the right balance, we have to be both embrace the notion of spiritual practice of some sort, to recognize our connectedness to each other and to the earth itself. And that's where the healing takes place.
I love that. I love that. You're making me think about the spiritual relationship that binds all of humanity, right? Because essentially we are, we're variations on a theme, to quote a construct that's very prevalent in jazz music, right? You have all of these players. Somebody's on the bass, somebody's on the drums, somebody's on the alto saxophone, somebody's on the horn, and they're all dancing around this core thematic structure. But they're also improving, but they're bound together by that core structure. And I think within the context of the human family, that core structure is our spiritual interconnectedness, right? And it makes me think about, it's so interesting because you're touching on so many points that just got my mind just turning over, touching my spirit and turning over my mind in so many profound ways. But I'm thinking about how we enter into the dialogue surrounding colonialism and racism, right? I think quite oftentimes what we have seen within our contemporary society is that the narratives that have been told, understandably so, have been from the perspective of those who have suffered as a result of colonialism, right? Who have been on the receiving end of the effects of colonialism. However, I think the chapter that has yet to be written is to really do a deep analysis on how those that were colonizing also hurt and harmed themselves. and the legacy that they have wrought within themselves, because essentially that's a Faustian bargain. But there's two sides to that coin. And I think we oftentimes pay attention to the one and forget the other, that there's this other side of the coin that also has to be mourned and confronted if we're really going to do the healing work.
I think that's right. And can we have a three-sided coin?
Yes, please. Give it to me. I love three. Let's do it. Yes.
So if you think about colonialism, you think about whiteness, there's a book by Theodore Allen called The Invention of the White Race. And he reminds us that, first of all, the whiteness as a construct was created, has a history. But in the early colonies in the United States, the elites were European, many of them royal, and then there were the workers. So initially, European workers, African workers worked side by side, and to a less extent, Native Americans. And there was a big rebellion called the Bacon Rebellion, where Europeans and Africans rebelled against the elites. Notice it wasn't blacks and whites, because blacks and whiteness in terms of social constructs had not come into being. And it took time, almost 100 years. But after that rebellion, the elites felt like they had to break up the Africans and the Europeans from making common cause. It wasn't easy. So what they did is they created what's called the middle stratum. The middle stratum is now what we call whites. And the middle stratum, their role was to have allegiance to the elites and patrol the blacks. And Native Americans were largely off to the side. So from the very beginning, whiteness was not the elites. And the European elites at that time did not refer to themselves as white. They were Europeans. Whiteness was for the middle stratum. And so it's always been, as you said, a Faustian deal where people who identify say, what are you going to get for being white? Well, you don't have anything, but you get to patrol blacks. And we actually had the first expression of slave patrols in that time, but these were foot soldiers for white dominance, right? So we fast forward today, and we still have some of that. We have a lot of people who are somewhere distributed on that stratum that are called white, but they think whiteness was, the real dominant. It was not whiteness as a concept. That was a relatively second time. No one, at least, didn't want to be white. They didn't want to be in that middle stratum. That was for those other folks. That was for those, indentured servants. And they were servants. When you go back to England, and it was the main country, but France as well, the kings and queens, they didn't have any respect for the peasants. They didn't make common cause with the peasants. So you're absolutely right that, and W.E. Du Bois said that as we tried to give birth to a democracy in the United States, we traded it in for white supremacy, for concept of white supremacy. And so understanding the creation of whiteness as a idea of dominance is important, because it not only robbed Native Americans of their land in concert with the elites, and robbed many Africans of their bodies, it robbed white people of their soul. And that's why the book, I talk about a new self, racing to justice to create a new self, because the concept of whiteness from its very beginning is fraught with fear, anxiety, struggle. And so it's not coincidental that we have more guns than people in the United States. And when you need to dominate, in this case, dominate not just Black people, not just Native people, not just people who are colonized, you need to dominate the earth itself. It's like you're in a constant state of fear. We are one of the most fearful countries in the world, not safest, one of the most fearful. And so sometimes people ask me, so why would people give up whiteness? It's like, are you kidding me? It's like, do you see what they're getting? Killing, suicide rate is extremely high. Mental health rate is extremely high. People are extremely unhappy. And okay, so I'm better than the blacks. You might be able to, but even that became more difficult to sell after Obama became president. It's like, really? Am I better off economically? Am I better off educationally? How am I better off? And so a friend of mine wrote a book called Wages of Whiteness. In the book, he tries to chronicle what you got for being white. There was a deal. It was like, okay, this is what you get. If you can kill a black person with impunity. You can call them names. Do I get a house? No. Do I get health care? No. Do I get education? No. It's like, I tell you what you get. You get these things over here. And the good thing about the movement of the civil rights movement and before is that as we start becoming more of a democratic society, in some ways, the wages of whiteness were reduced. Like at one point in the South, right, the white primaries, white only, you get to vote, they don't get to vote. Okay, now you get to vote and they get to vote. It's like, well, if my whole sense of being is predicated on my being better than them, that doesn't feel so good. They get to vote too. Mm. And so you had this really stirring white anxiety because it was losing something in relationship to blacks. But it never had what we all need as human beings from the beginning, and that is profound, deep connection. And just to end on this, a lot of people who are phenotypically white tries and have been trying to reject the notion of white supremacy, but they don't know how. It's not something you can just do as a mental construct. You have to sort of think about it in terms of where you live. And there was a guy who was joining in and keeping blacks out of his neighborhoods. And he said, I have nothing against black people, but if a black person moves in my neighborhood, the home value goes down, right? So I'm incentivized to act in a racist way. He may have been right or wrong, but he was saying it's not personal animus. It's I need the money. So we have to help people and help create structures where there's some alternative and where all people can be fully human.
I love that. There's the quote from Toni Morrison, or the interview that she had with Charlie Rose, which I thought was brilliant. And so many people have seen it by now. But where Charlie Rose asked her a question, and she said, that's the wrong question. He was asking something to the effect of why she always chooses to write about black people. And he asked her, well, what's the right question? And she goes on to talk about, if your sense of self-esteem is predicated on making someone else feel small, that is a very serious problem. And we look along the continuum of history in the United States, and we see that every time there has been a gain by a marginalized group, that impinges on the mythology of white supremacy. I was just watching the brilliant documentary about the life of Jack Johnson. Now, this is a man who's the first black heavyweight in the United States, right? Yeah. First world heavyweight champion. He becomes heavyweight champion in the early 1900s and was also unapologetic about wanting to live his life a certain way. Now, people can argue about how Jack Johnson lived his life, but he was determined to be his own man. Yeah, absolutely. But the kind of pathological and just venomous search for a white challenger to dethrone this black man who had the audacity to knock out white fighters in the ring was just, there's something so, on the one hand, about it that makes you angry, but on the other hand, that also makes you also deeply pity any group of people or any individual who feels like they have to do something to stop that forward progress in order to make their own selves feel good, feel better about themselves. So that indicates to me that there's a vacuum within the self. There is a void within the self that they have not reconciled with, that anybody's not reconciled if that's the way that they move through life, with, that they have to reconcile with, that emptiness that's within the self.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite deep. And I mean, you can, Jack Johnson is a powerful expression of that, but so is, Joe Louis. And when Joe Louis beat, at that time, someone representing Nazis, the United States, he was white, so it was very ambivalent. And when Coca-Cola then needed a poster child to help sell Coca-Cola, they didn't pick Joe Louis. They picked the white Nazi he had beat, Joe Louis, at some point.
I think it's Max Schmeling. Wasn't
Exactly,
it Max Schmeling?
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Joe Louis gave all his money to the government to help World War II. Then they said he hadn't paid taxes on it. He'd already given them the money, right? I mean, it's like they just messed him up so many ways. And then, of course, we think about Muhammad Ali. Same.
Yeah.
So the need for a number of white people, for black people to be below them, is maddening. And in that threat, it's not black people, gays, Jews, Muslims. The hatred and the smallness, trading on fear. And I think the real careful thing, the real important thing is that for people, black, white, or otherwise, not to embrace that fear. So sometimes if you get attacked by white people, by white supremacists, by Proud Boys, by Oath Keepers, you want to attack back. And I think one of the things I worry a little bit now is that many of the people associated with social justice movements are sort of flirting with the kind of new black essentialism, black nationalism, which doesn't reflect who we are. You mentioned Bell Hooks. Bell and I both write about the multiplicity of the self. The self is constantly being remade. It's remade partially in relationship to the environment and other people, and not to sort of fall victim to the belief that there's a essentialism to any racial identity. We, for the most part, didn't integrate schools. We actually had desegregation. We took black kids and put them in white environments, oftentimes in the basement, oftentimes being disciplined, fired the black teachers. The white teachers, absolutely, many of them didn't care about the black kids. So the whole experience for blacks, whites, and otherwise was negative. And then people turned around and said, see, we tried, it failed. We never tried. That was not, and the court was actually quite clear. We had by that time a conservative court, and they said, Brown does not promise integration, they promise desegregation, which is quite different. And if we really had integration in the way that King talked about it, there wouldn't be any more white schools. When I talked about inclusion, the black kids show up at the school, and it's like, this is a white school. So now, how do I suppose to belong at a white school when whiteness is defined in opposition to blackness, as opposed to this is not a black school or a white school? So we can do it better. There's some schools that have done it better, but not on a national level. And we have to do it better. So one approach, false universalism, there are many different expressions of it. One is that I treat everybody the same, universal in my treatment, right? So I treat the blind person and the sighted person the same. Here's your driver's license. Good luck, right? I treat the person in a wheelchair and the person who's ambulatory the same. Even that claim is oftentimes predicated on a background notion of the dominant society. So in San Francisco, there was a period of time not too long ago where they wanted to teach children in their native language. And the educator said, no, you teach everybody in the same language, English. I said, these kids don't speak English. So we're treating everybody the same. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And now it just seems silly almost, right? Or think about COVID. We treat everybody the same. We say, if you are afraid of the virus, make sure you wash your hands 15 times a day. Everybody. And Native Americans said on the Hopi and Navajo reservation, about 40% of people didn't have access to water. So that's false universalism. It's not what we're after. We don't want to treat everybody the same. And usually it's like treat everybody the same based on my norms.
Yeah.
It's back to inclusion. Everybody can come in as long as you're just like me. As long as you go to church on Sunday and not Saturday. As long as you don't wear, a headdress or a veil. As long as you pray to the same God. So that's a false universalism. Targeted universalism says that the treatment is not universal. The goal is universal. The goal is universal. And the treatment or intervention is targeted. And what is it targeted on? It's targeted based on how we're situated. So our situatedness calls upon us to treat people differently. You know that old saying that you prohibit the rich man and the unhoused man from urinating in the streets. You're treating them the same, except the rich man can go into his house or any restaurant and urinate. And we treat people who are with housing as pariah. So we are not acknowledging that they're situated differently. Because they're situated differently, the situation requires that they be treated differently. And there's hundreds of examples of that. I'll give you one last one, or maybe two. Think about an airline. Airlines, your luggage racks on airlines are overhead. And is there a population that's shorter than other parts of the population? Yes. They're called women or females. As a group, women are shorter than men. As a group, women has less upper body strength than men. And as a group, women are more likely to carry luggage than men. So think about that. So now you have the group, the majority are women, and we put luggage racks way up over the head. And so you know what a lot of women do to manage that? They check their luggage. But that's mean they have to pay a tax because now they have to get to the airport half an hour to an hour earlier so they can check their luggage. And they leave the airport an hour later to pick up their luggage. And sometimes their luggage gets lost. So they try to make this intervention for this structure. So again, the person who designed that is not necessarily thinking about women, but that's the point. They're not thinking about women, right? And the last example, just recently, about 3 weeks ago, there was this Black woman who's a doctor. Her son had COVID symptoms. She takes him to the hospital and she said, I think my son has COVID. Can you admit him and test him? And they run some tests and they say, we tested him. He does not have COVID. What do you mean doesn't have COVID? We gave the oxygen meter and his oxygen level is very high, which was inconsistent with having COVID. And she said, they said, we think he has asthma. We're going to give you some asthma medicine and send him home. She said, no, you're not. I'm a doctor. My son does not have asthma. I think he has COVID. And said, we ran the test. He does not have COVID. They went back and forth. And because she was a doctor and assertive, they humored her. Say, okay. Just to get you off her back, we'll run some more tests. And so she said, I want you to draw some blood and test his blood. Turns out he had COVID. And if he had gone home, he probably would have died. What was the mistake? The mistake was that the oxygen meter that probably many of us use is inaccurate if you have melanin in your skin. The more melanin in your skin, the less accurate the oxygen meter is. So that meter, right, it's like treat everybody the same. No, you have melanin. I want this machine that's designed for people with melanin. You know, so you don't want to treat everybody the same. You want to treat everyone with human dignity. You want to make sure that everyone has a chance to have good health care. So you want these outcomes to be the same. But in order to get there, you got to have targeted strategies, not because someone has melanin, but because they're situated differently in relationship to structures.
Essentially what you're saying is unity and diversity, not unity and sameness, but an appreciation and a love for the diversity of the human family. And a targeted approach that recognizes that diversity and celebrates diversity as actually the basis of unity. Because the entire natural environment is diversified. As we're talking about a world that is more interdependent, that protects the dignity and nobility of every human being, that honors and respects the environment that we live in, and that is progressively kind of spiritually situated in such a way that we recognize that we are first spiritual beings having a physical experience. And that's the predicate off of which we operate. And I'm wondering for you, thinking about the future as we're moving forward, as we're evolving as a human species, what is your vision for the future? What does that construct look like for you?
Well, I think as a number of people have said, that we are at an inflection point. The idea of breaking is that the other is seen as a threat, need to be controlled and contained, sometimes killed. So the other is seen as a disease, as an infection in some way. They're not fully human. That's called breaking. When we tell stories about the apparent other, and the other can be someone who on the other side of a cleavage. And there's what I call short bridges and long bridges. Short bridges are people who you share a lot with, but you still don't get along. Maybe you don't like the same music. It looks like something small. Like there's a fight between vegans and vegetarians. Some people say, what's the difference anyway? Then there are long bridges. Someone thinks about a Trump supporter and a Bernie supporter, or white supremacists and a Black Lives Matter. And they think about us a long bridge. So I say start with shorter bridges. I had a Christian minister saying, are you telling me I have to bridge with the devil? And I said, don't start there. Start with a shorter bridge, but also be careful who you call the devil. And we should understand that bridging doesn't mean you agree with someone. It doesn't mean you give up who you are. But it does mean you insist upon the other person's humanity. Sabawano. It means you're willing to see the person, even if you disagree with them. It doesn't mean you embrace their policies. You embrace their humanity, even if they don't. Bridging is predicated on the notion that I'm willing to see the other person. I'm willing to listen to the other person. I'm willing to hear their story, not adopt it. And when bridging is really working, we actually have compassionate dialogue. We have compassionate practice. And something magical oftentimes happens when people bridge. Unfortunately, most of our stories in movies are breaking stories. We're always talking about the evil other who's trying to take our jobs, take our wives, take our land, take our, threatening us in some way, threatening our culture. So we have to be better at telling bridging stories and bridging practices. And it's hard because if someone's attacking you, it's hard to stay open and listen to them when they're not listening to you. And so then maybe, even if we aren't going to bridge, can we at least try not to break? It's not surprising that human humility and earth all have the same root, that we have certain humility, that we're not so arrogant. And we don't know everything. We never will know everything. So the other vision is one of where we recognize, instead of turning on each other, we turn toward each other. We lost a tremendous opportunity with the virus. There was a period of time when over 3 billion people were locked down. Everybody in the world essentially was having a similar experience. That was been a great time for someone to sort of help us see our interconnectedness. In some ways it was terrifying, but in some ways it was beautiful. The virus is saying, I don't care if you build a wall, I don't care if you drown planes, you all are connected. And I'm going to show you. It's like, when they first announced the virus in China, and I said, literally, it's already here. The idea that we're going to keep it in China, and it's like, wait a minute, it wasn't come from China, it was actually come from Europe. So the virus was saying, how do I spread? I spread because human beings are deeply interconnected. They had a very powerful response, I think, in Singapore. And they got hold of it and they got the numbers down really fast. And then a month later, it exploded. And the reason it exploded is that Singapore has a number of guest workers. They're not Singaporeans. And so they actually only treated the Singaporeans and didn't treat their workers. And the virus said, okay, they count too. So I see, hopefully, that we can recognize we're spiritually interconnected beings. And we have to actually, we can't save the earth or the world for my group, for my country. It's everyone. This king tried to teach us that over and over and over again. So I think people are struggling with that. I think people are trying to get there. I think you mentioned earlier about being Baha'i. I think people need a practice to help them with that because it's counterintuitive to the way we set up the world.
Yes.
Especially in the United States. You go to Europe, people still ride public transportation. You get in the United States, public transportation are for those who are left behind. Everybody else is in their private automobile. We used to build porches on the front of the streets so you could see your neighbors. We now build them in the back so we can keep our privacy. So I think we need a new story, a story where all of us are part of the story, where we see each other, we recognize that the other is a myth, and that's reflected on music, in our movies, in our culture, in our dance, in our religion, in our physical planning. And the last thing I'll say is that people are experiencing a lot of fear. Part of the reason is the world is changing. A few years ago, I was in Milwaukee, and there was demonstrations because they had let 2 Latinos into the college there. And there was literally people on the streets marching against these Latinos being let into the school. At the same time, one of the major factories was closing. It was going to lay off thousands of workers, nobody demonstrating. But people were worried about jobs going to Mexico. And all the research says jobs are going to AI, to robots. I mean, you're sort of fighting the wrong fights. And the world is changing. And it's anxious producing. It's scary. But it's only scary, again, if we are turning against each other. If we realize we turn toward each other, the world will still change, but it could change for the better.
Wow. Well, I'm so happy and so honored that you spent this time with us. Really helped us to facilitate a space where we are turning towards each other and not away from each other.
I feel blessed to be able to co-create with the two of you.
No, it's beautiful. This is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.